48. It may have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis. By the time we began our hearings in June 2022, Donald Trump's dealings with Department of Justice official Jeffrey Clark had already gotten some press. The DOJ's Inspector General had reportedly been investigating, and a Senate committee had interviewed some of the people involved. My opening statement at our first hearing had highlighted how we thought Trump's dealings with Clark fit into Trump's larger plans to overturn the election. On June 22, 2022, as we were preparing for our hearing on this topic, the Justice Department served a search warrant on Clark at his home in the suburbs outside Washington. It was now apparent that DOJ was following the same path as our committee. A number of facts relating to the Trump-Clark story are important. First, the context. By late December of 2020, it was clear to Donald Trump that the Department of Justice investigations had found no significant election fraud. Attorney General Bill Barr, Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen, and Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue had all told him so repeatedly. At the same time, none of Trump's efforts to persuade state legislatures to flip Biden electoral votes was working. A member of the House Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry, was apparently telling Mark Meadows and others that Jeffrey Clark could help fix both of those problems. The idea was that Clark could draft a letter to be sent from the Department of Justice to the key state legislatures, beginning with Georgia's. The letter would falsely announce that the Department of Justice had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. Second, the letter would recommend a very specific course of action, which was almost exactly what Trump and John Eastman were simultaneously urging legislators in Georgia to do. Quote, in light of these developments, the department recommends that the Georgia General Assembly should convene in special session and consider approving a new slate of electors. Clark's draft letter was originally written for Rosen's and Donahue's signatures, but both of them refused to sign it. Donahue confronted Clark, telling him the letter was not based on fact, that it was not something the Justice Department should ever do, and that it could have, quote, grave consequences for the country. It may very well have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis. In an email, Donahue warned Clark that the draft letter, quote, could have tremendous constitutional, political, and social ramifications for the country. During our June 22nd hearing, Rosen and Donahue sat at our witness table and carefully explained all of this. The hearing was led by Adam Kinzinger, who presented the evidence and led much of the questioning in a clear and compelling way. Once it became clear that neither Rosen nor Donahue would sign the letter, Donald Trump resolved to replace Rosen with Clark, so Clark could sign and issue the letter himself. Clark had several conversations with Trump, including on January 3rd, and White House call logs referred to Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general because Trump had already appointed him. When Rosen learned what was happening with Clark, he was determined to put a stop to it. Rosen called White House counsel Pat Cipollone, and an urgent meeting was set with the president for the evening of Sunday, January 3rd. Rosen, Donahue, and Steve Engel, who had served in the Trump Justice Department for most of the administration, along with White House lawyers Pat Cipollone, Pat Philbin, and Eric Hirschman, attended the Oval Office meeting in addition to Clark. My sense is that Cipollone was integral to making this meeting happen, and that he, along with Hirschman and others, knew there was only one way to make Trump back down. They had to convince Trump that naming Clark as Attorney General would harm Trump personally. After a lengthy discussion trying to persuade Trump that Clark was not qualified to be Attorney General, they all threatened to resign if Clark took over as AG. They told Trump that virtually all of his other appointees in the Justice Department would resign as well. This would quite likely be followed by a wave of resignations by Trump officials in other agencies. In short, appointing Clark would cause a blow-up with significant ramifications for Trump personally and politically. That ultimately worked. Trump backed down as to Clark's appointment as acting attorney general. One other key fact was clear from the June 22nd hearing. Acting Deputy Attorney General Donahue testified that Trump had told him this in a phone call about the election: "Just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." Elsewhere in the call, Trump mentioned Representatives Jim Jordan and Scott Perry specifically. In early August, about 5 weeks after this hearing, the Department of Justice served a search warrant on Perry and seized his cell phone. Although Cipollone, Rosen, and others were successful in reversing Trump's appointment of Jeffrey Clark, they could not persuade Trump to stop pursuing the fake stolen election allegations. And they did not manage to stop Trump's other plans for January 6th, which continued to gain steam as that date approached. As the Clark hearing wound down, we were also working to bring in yet more evidence about what was happening inside the White House during the violence of January 6th. Chairman Thompson announced that the next hearing would take place, quote, "in the coming weeks." The press interpreted that to mean we would adjourn until July. That is not what happened. 49. Hideaway 2.0. The Watergate scandal leading to President Richard Nixon's 1974 resignation resulted in the prosecution and conviction of multiple members of Nixon's White House staff. The crimes included obstruction of justice and perjury, lying under oath in an effort to conceal what individuals in the White House had known about the break-in and the role Nixon had played in its cover-up. I wanted to believe that at least some of those serving in the Trump White House were familiar with the history of the Watergate scandal and would know they could not get away with lying about what had happened before, during, and after the attack of January 6th. Ultimately, we found a number of honest people who told the unvarnished truth. One of these people is Cassidy Hutchinson, who had served as Mark Meadows' principal aide in the White House. She had been interviewed twice by the committee earlier in 2022. As mentioned, upon reading portions of her testimony in a brief we filed as part of our litigation with Mark Meadows, Hutchinson recognized that she needed to find a way to provide the committee with additional information. Counsel for the committee had set up a third interview with her at the end of May so she could answer additional questions. Most of the committee's interviews were conducted in the O'Neill House Office Building, where the committee staff had office space. Knowing this, reporters routinely staked out the building entrances to monitor who was coming and going. We knew that Cassidy was already facing tremendous pressure from the Trump camp. She was also well known to many members of Congress and their staffs because she had worked directly with many of us over the last few years. We didn't want to create any additional pressure on her, so we needed to find a discreet place to conduct the third interview. Jamie Fleet provided us with a small conference room on the third floor of the Cannon House office building, tucked in beside an elevator bank. Even though journalists and camera crews were permanently posted just down the hall in the Cannon Rotunda, none noticed as Cassidy got off the elevator, turned a corner, and entered the small office. Cassidy provided us with additional important information, but she was obviously nervous about her Trump-affiliated lawyer and initially gave only short answers. Our committee counsel and I took turns asking her specific questions and followed up in areas where we sensed she had more detail. We drew out additional details piece by piece. At the close of the session, as Cassidy and her lawyer were leaving, she paused and turned back to me. I gave her a hug, and I thanked her. "I want you to know," I said, "that I have 3 daughters who are about your age. If they ever had to face what you have, I can only hope they would show the same courage that you have." Tears welled in her eyes. It was obvious that Cassidy was under tremendous stress. It was equally obvious that she was determined to do what was right. Our committee counsel walked Cassidy and her lawyer to the exit. I later learned what Cassidy had quietly told our counsel on the way out the door: "I'm about to get effing nuked." She meant the Trump team would soon learn what she had done and attempt to destroy her and her reputation. Her instinct proved correct. Cassidy later explained to us on the record what happened next. Her lawyer, who she had recently confirmed was paid by a Trump-affiliated group, answered a call from a New York Times reporter in the cab as they were leaving the interview, even though Cassidy asked him not to. A short while later, the newspaper's senior political correspondent, Maggie Haberman, tweeted, "Former Meadows aide Cassidy Hutchinson went back to the J6 committee under subpoena for a second interview today, per People briefed." Haberman was apparently unaware that this was actually Cassidy's third interview with the committee. Against Cassidy's wishes, her lawyer also called counsel for at least one other Trump witness to report on the interview. We already knew what type of pressure had been applied by Trump and his team to Shea Moss, Ruby Freeman, Speaker Bowers, Secretary Raffensperger, and many others. Cassidy had just told us in the Cannon interview room about several conversations she overheard during the violence on January 6th, describing Donald Trump as unwilling to instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. We worried about her safety. As Cassidy testified in a later committee interview, she sought advice from a number of people about what to do about her Trump-funded lawyer, including from a Republican member of Congress who was not on our committee. Cassidy, like all witnesses, deserved counsel who would give her independent and objective advice, including about what to do with respect to her existing lawyer. According to one report, she consulted with former Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, too, who offered to help start a legal defense fund, quote, so that Ms. Hutchinson would not have to rely on a lawyer paid for by Trump affiliates. Not long after this third interview, Cassidy contacted me directly. She told me that she was inclined to represent herself going forward. I was very sympathetic to her situation, but I did not want our committee to be advising her on what she should do next. I told Cassidy that she could consult another lawyer and seek his or her independent advice on how best to move forward. Every witness deserves an attorney who will represent their interests exclusively. Ultimately, Cassidy decided to retain two new lawyers, both with prior experience in the Justice Department. One had been appointed a few years earlier by President Trump to oversee the Justice Department's Civil Division. The other had served at Justice during the George W. Bush administration. They represented Cassidy pro bono, that is, without charging her anything. In mid-June, in the midst of our hearings, Cassidy's new lawyers notified the committee staff that she had further information to share. We set Cassidy's next interview for June 20th, when the House would be out of session for Juneteenth. We suspected that almost no one would be in the Capitol building that day. Two things worried me: Cassidy's security and committee leaks. Key investigative material had already been leaked. Any leaks about a new Cassidy interview could be harmful to her and to our investigation. Cassidy had already been contacted by people in the Trump orbit, warning her, among other things, that, quote, Trump reads the transcripts and pays close attention to what witnesses are saying. We decided to hold this June interview in my Capitol basement hideaway office, the same room where Alyssa Farah, Sarah Matthews, and I had met several months earlier. Members of my Capitol Police security detail and our committee counsel met Cassidy and one of her new lawyers and escorted them to the basement office, where I waited with committee counsel and staff from the office of the Clerk of the House, who transcribed all of our interviews. No reporters saw Cassidy enter. My hideaway office was cramped. The office itself was maybe 10 feet across and perhaps 15 to 20 feet long, with a narrow table running lengthwise and a small sofa and chair filling up much of the remaining space. There were no windows. The ventilation wasn't great. Those who viewed the January 6th committee hearings have seen witnesses such as Bill Barr seated at a table in a large interview room, surrounded by a team of lawyers. When you watch Cassidy's testimony from June 20th, you see her sitting at that narrow table. Her lawyer sat beside her. We made room at one end of the table for the House stenographer and at the other end for the video camera. Committee counsel and I sat across from Cassidy. From the beginning of that interview to the end, Cassidy provided further significant detail to supplement everything she had told us before. She was exacting, noting with careful precision what she could and could not remember. She had careful notes and referred to them often. She obviously wanted to get this right. We explored a greater range of topics than in any prior interview. As soon as the interview ended, Cassidy was escorted out by Capitol Police, again, without anyone in the press spotting her. I instantly recognized that we had just gathered much important new material, as did our committee staff and counsel. Before this interview, our tentative plan had been for Cassidy Hutchinson to appear at our final hearing of the summer, scheduled for the second half of July, possibly along with two other former members of the White House staff, Sarah Matthews and Matt Pottinger. We thought these witnesses would provide powerful testimony about what happened in the West Wing during the violence and why Donald Trump had failed to act. But Cassidy's new testimony went further than that of either Matthews or Pottinger, and it was more detailed. Cassidy was giving us specific insight about Trump and Mark Meadows and about what White House counsel Pat Cipollone and other senior staff had urged President Trump to do during the violence. By that point, we had met informally with Cipollone, but he had repeatedly declined to give us any recorded testimony. My sense, as we sat in the basement hideaway, was that we would not be able to keep this testimony secret for very long. Everything we did as a committee was under an intense spotlight. Every hearing was viewed live by millions of people, covered by virtually every major news broadcast, and consumed hours of programming on cable news. Reporters were calling nearly everyone involved with the investigation, desperately seeking information. We had suffered many leaks already, some harmful to our effort. But now a leak wouldn't harm just the committee. It could also place Cassidy Hutchinson in a difficult and possibly dangerous situation. The longer we delayed, the higher the risk. Other witnesses, including a number of national security and military staff posted at the White House, had likewise identified concerns about retribution from Donald Trump and his allies, and the committee had taken special measures to protect their security. But Cassidy's name was already out there in published press reports. Cassidy's testimony might fit better in our planned late July hearing, but we could not reasonably ask her to wait that long. We needed to act quickly. After some initial discussions with senior staff on the evening of June 20th, 2022, we began to formulate plans for a new hearing, a hearing that no one in the press or on our committee had anticipated. A key part of Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony related to what White House counsel Pat Cipollone had said and done during the violent attack on the Capitol. My instinct was that Cassidy's public testimony would make it even harder for Cipollone to refuse to appear for a taped interview. Pat might still be coaxed to testify voluntarily, we believed, because he probably wanted the public to know that he had tried to do the right thing. Pat had vehemently disagreed with the nonsense being spouted by Rudy Giuliani and others, and he probably wanted that fact on the historical record. There was no question that Pat Cipollone had crucial information about what had happened inside the White House on January 6th. We were in the process of preparing for two additional hearings that week, and I decided to use my closing statement at the June 21st hearing to launch a more public effort to persuade Cipollone to come forward and testify on camera. That evening, Phil and I worked to draft language that might sway him. I began by listing other high-ranking Trump administration witnesses who had already testified, including Bill Barr and Jeff Rosen, both of whom were Pat's close friends. And then I said this: "But the American people have not yet heard from Mr. Trump's former White House counsel, Pat Cipollone. Our committee is certain that Donald Trump does not want Mr. Cipollone to testify here. Indeed, our evidence shows that Mr. Cipollone and his office tried to do what was right. They tried to stop a number of President Trump's plans for January 6th. Today and in our coming hearings, you will hear testimony from other Trump White House staff explaining what Mr. Cipollone said and did, including on January 6th. But we think the American people deserve to hear from Mr. Cipollone personally. He should appear before this committee, and we are working to secure his testimony." A few days later, the chairman and a small group of committee staff crowded around a laptop in my hideaway office to watch portions of the video of Cassidy's June 20th testimony. Everyone present immediately realized that her latest testimony was a dramatic step forward. By Friday, June 24th, most members of the committee had left town to spend the weekend in their districts. Many committee staffers had been working day and night on the June 21st and 22nd hearings, and they deserved a break. Except for Chairman Thompson and the handful of committee lawyers and staff now squeezed into my hideaway office, almost no one knew what we were contemplating doing. We now had interview material from Cassidy that could easily fill a 3-hour hearing. Everyone present shared my fears about her security and about leaks. We knew we couldn't wait. We began to plan a hearing for the following Tuesday. 50. Ketchup on the wall. I had already shared some of what we had earlier heard from Cassidy Hutchinson in my June 9th opening statement, that Donald Trump thought Mike Pence deserved to be hanged, and that Donald Trump did not think his violent supporters were doing anything wrong. But Cassidy's recent interview had produced much more detailed information. For example, after Meadows told Pat Cipollone that President Trump, quote, doesn't want to do anything about the violence, Cipollone had replied, "Something needs to be done, or people are going to die, and the blood is going to be on your effing hands." Cassidy was aware of the many Republicans, both inside and outside the White House, who had been desperately trying to get Donald Trump to appear on television and demand that the violent mob stand down and leave the Capitol. And she knew how frustrated senior White House staff were when Trump refused to do what virtually all of them thought was imperative. But Cassidy also possessed many other insights directly relevant to what Donald Trump and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows were thinking, information that could make Meadows a key witness for any Justice Department investigation of Trump. Cassidy testified, for example, that the White House had begun receiving information about the threat of violence even before President Trump's ellipse speech, and that Meadows had recognized in advance that January 6th could be violent. She testified that President Trump understood there were weapons in the crowd before he instructed his supporters to march to the Capitol. She testified that President Trump's White House legal team was worried about the contents of his ellipse speech. And Hutchinson had heard in detail from other White House staff that President Trump was obviously and demonstrably angry, both in the presidential limo and upon his subsequent return to the White House, after being informed by Secret Service agents that he could not lead the crowd to the Capitol. This last point was something we had heard from several others as well, including other White House witnesses, law enforcement, and off-the-record informants. Much of this is detailed in pages 74 to 75 of our final report. A national security professional posted in the White House may have best summarized why Trump's intent to lead the crowd to the Capitol was relevant to how we thought about Donald Trump's conduct.
To be completely honest, we were all in a state of shock.
Because why?
Because it's just, one, I think the actual physical feasibility of doing it, and then also we all knew what that implicated and what that meant, that this was no longer a rally, that this was going to move to something else if he physically walked to the Capitol. I don't know if you want to use the word insurrection, coup, whatever. We all knew that this would move from a normal democratic, public event into something else.
The most damning evidence of all, in my view, was that Trump had refused for hours to instruct the rioters to leave the Capitol. He had the ability to stop it all at the outset, but he wouldn't. He watched and let it happen. What type of man would refuse for hours on end to instruct a violent mob of his supporters attacking the Capitol and the police to stand down and leave? Cassidy Hutchinson gave a sense of the answer to that question, too. She described a man who was uncontrollably angry with Bill Barr's statements refuting Trump's stolen election allegations.
The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall, which was causing them to have to clean up. So I grabbed a towel and started wiping the ketchup off of the wall to help the valet out. And he said something to the effect of, he's really ticked off about this. I would stay clear of him for right now. He's really, really ticked off about this right now.
For nearly 2 hours on June 28, 2022, Cassidy Hutchinson, at age 26, sat at a witness table before a congressional panel, alone in the national spotlight, answering question after question calmly and methodically. When a conservative commentator posted his story in National Review that evening, he wrote, "Things will not be the same after this." Millions of Americans shared this conclusion. Cassidy Hutchinson had shown more courage and patriotism than White House officials in positions senior to hers, with many more years of experience. As we expected, her willingness to tell the truth made her the target of intense attacks in the media from Donald Trump and his supporters. I wondered whether the onslaught would have been as fierce had she been a man. I suspect not. Cassidy never wavered. I was proud of her. As an American and as a mother, I was also deeply grateful for her love of country. Until Cassidy testified, we had no luck in persuading Pat Cipollone to testify. The day after her testimony, the committee sent Pat Cipollone a subpoena. Pat immediately changed course. He appeared for a recorded interview a little over a week later. 51. We did our duty and we stood for truth. The morning after our June 28th hearing, I flew to Southern California for a speech at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. I had been to the library many times, including as a member of the House Armed Services Committee for the annual Reagan National Defense Forum. On a prior visit, I had been walking through the exhibits about Reagan's life when I was surprised to hear my dad's voice. I turned a corner to see a video playing of the eulogy he gave for President Reagan. I stood and watched. Speaking in the Capitol Rotunda, my dad recalled the words of President Reagan's second inaugural address.
Ronald Reagan spoke of a nation that was hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was how he saw America, and that is how America came to know him. There was a kindness, simplicity, and goodness of character that marked all the years of his life.
In his eulogy, he also talked about Reagan's will and his love of freedom.
More than any other influence, the Cold War was ended by the perseverance and courage of one man who answered falsehood with truth and overcame evil with good.
I was reminded of what it felt like to have a president who was kind and good, a president your children could look up to. And I was moved to see my father talking about Ronald Reagan. Those were the men who exemplified the Republican Party I had joined. The Reagan Library had invited me to speak as part of its A Time for Choosing series, highlighting leading Republicans talking about the future of our party and country. When I had spoken at the library previously, the audience had always been warm and welcoming. Now, however, I wasn't sure how the mostly Republican crowd would respond. Notices had appeared online that Trump supporters were organizing to protest and disrupt the speech, but none of that happened. When I walked into the packed auditorium, I was surprised to receive a standing ovation. I had cast my first vote in a presidential election at age 18 in 1984 for Ronald Reagan. Today, I still believe that President Reagan has, perhaps better than almost any U.S. president since Abraham Lincoln, expressed the nobility and honor of our great nation. I began my speech by remembering how President Reagan's vision of American freedom had transformed the world. He had inspired millions, and he taught us what was required of us all in the defense of freedom. In 1983, Reagan had warned, "It is up to us in our time to choose and choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best, while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day. The choice confronting Republicans in the aftermath of January 6th was clear, although it could be painful for them to accept. Here's how I described that choice. Republicans cannot both be loyal to Donald Trump and loyal to the Constitution. At this moment, and as we think about this choice, and as I think about how I come to this choice, the first thing that I think about is that I come to this choice as a mother, committed to ensuring that my children and their children can continue to live in an America where the peaceful transfer of power is guaranteed. We must ensure that we live in a nation that is governed by law and not by men. And I come to this choice as an American, as a citizen of the greatest nation God has ever created on the face of this earth. And I come to this choice as a person of faith, as someone who believes deeply that our rights come from God, not from the government, and always mindful that we must pray as though everything depends upon God, because it does, and we must work as though everything depends upon us, because it does. I remembered those last lines from the sermon delivered by the Navy chaplain at the Camp David Presidential Retreat on the first Sunday following 9/11. They are from a prayer of St. Ignatius. Near the end of the speech, I recalled Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony from the January 6th committee hearing the day before. Her bravery and her patriotism yesterday were awesome to behold. Little girls all across this great nation are seeing what it really means to love this country and what it really means to be a patriot. The crowd interrupted me and applauded Cassidy and her courage. In closing, I asked everyone listening to resolve to do what was necessary to defend our great country. So let us all, as we leave here tonight, let us resolve that we will embrace the grace and the compassion and the love of country that unites us. Let us resolve that we will fight to do what is right, and that we will be able to look back on these days and to say, in our time of testing, we did our duty and we stood for truth. Ultimately, that is what our duty as Americans requires of us, that we love our country more, that we love her so much that we will stand above politics to defend her, and that we will do everything in our power to protect our Constitution and our freedom, paid for by the blood of so many. I was later told that most of the crowd, all of whom had to reserve tickets, were regular attendees at Reagan Library events. I was speaking to a largely Republican audience, and they had been watching our hearings, and they fully understood the courage of the young woman who had appeared alone on national television the day before. Cassidy watched the speech a few days later. When she heard the Reagan Library's overwhelming response as I mentioned her name, she confided to me later she couldn't hold in the tears. A few hours after my Reagan Library speech, I flew to Wyoming for the one and only primary debate for my House race. Wyoming covers nearly 100,000 square miles and has one member of Congress. In a Republican primary, there would usually be between 100,000 and 125,000 voters. 2 years earlier, I had won the Republican primary with 73% of the vote. In the general election that followed, I had received nearly 70% of the vote. Donald Trump had done a couple of percentage points better. No state in the country had given him a larger margin of victory. The people of Wyoming are tough. They have grit. I've always been proud of my family's Wyoming heritage. My maternal grandmother was the first woman to serve as a deputy sheriff in Natrona County. Her family walked across Wyoming on the Mormon Trail in the middle of the 19th century, before Wyoming became a state. One of my great-grandfathers left home in Missouri in the early 20th century, finding work first as a cowboy near Lysite, Wyoming in 1907, and then in the Salt Creek oil fields outside Casper. He and my great-grandmother raised 5 children in a hard-sided tent on the edge of the oil fields. Political opponents who accused me of not being from Wyoming almost never had roots in the state as deep as mine were. I was honored to represent this incredible place, and I was very proud of what my staff and I had accomplished for Wyoming since my election in 2016. Donald Trump, his family, and most of his closest advisors are from eastern cities. At the outset of the Trump administration, they were happy to help my state, but often did not know what the issues were or how to do what was needed. Beginning during the 2016 presidential transition, we had helped the new administration form its team in the federal agencies that mattered to Wyoming. And we had worked very closely with that team, introducing and passing legislation and steering policy. During the Trump administration, important policies changed in areas such as land use and energy policy. I was pleased to introduce and co-sponsor a number of pieces of legislation in these areas that were signed into law. Wyoming prospered. But 2022 was very different. I had watched thousands of hardworking, good-hearted people across Wyoming fall prey to Donald Trump's lies. Some truly believed the falsehoods he was spreading. Others knew the truth, but chose to perpetuate the lies. The Wyoming congressional debate was held at the Whitney Center for the Arts at Sheridan College. All 5 candidates were there. There was no anger at any point, either before or during the debate. I visited with all the candidates backstage beforehand, hugged those I knew and their families, and then took the stage. The other candidates echoed Trump's stolen election claims. My principal opponent, Harriet Hageman, had been endorsed by Donald Trump. She was an attorney and a member of the Wyoming Bar. I was surprised that she didn't have more respect for the rule of law. She didn't seem at all concerned about parroting the very election lies that had caused other attorneys in Trump's orbit to be sanctioned and disbarred. At the close of the debate, I wanted to describe in clear terms how I saw my duty. Here's what I said. I will never put party above my duty to the country. I will never put party above my duty to the Constitution. I swore an oath under God, and I will abide by that oath. I won't say something that I know is wrong simply to earn the votes of people, to earn political support. So I'm asking for your vote, and I'm asking you to understand that I will never violate my oath of office. And if you're looking for somebody who will, then you need to vote for somebody else on this stage, because I won't. I will always put my oath first. My constituents deserved the truth, even if it wasn't what many of them wanted to hear. 52. President Trump is a 76-year-old man. He is not an impressionable child. Pat Cipollone sat for his recorded interview on July 8, 2022. The January 6th committee had not planned to make any public statement following his interview. But that changed once we began to see leaks about the interview from Trump lawyers. We issued a suitable and measured response, summing up how important Cipollone's testimony had been. The committee, we said, received critical testimony on nearly every major topic in its investigation, reinforcing key points regarding Donald Trump's misconduct and providing highly relevant new information that will play a central role in its upcoming hearings. Our next 2 hearings demonstrated that this was exactly right. Pat Cipollone's testimony was a central feature of both of them. As we began our July 12th hearing, I reminded the viewers, if you have watched these hearings, you've heard us call for Mr. Cipollone to come forward to testify. He did, and Mr. Cipollone's testimony met our expectations. By the time the committee reached its July 12th hearing, a number of Trump's defenders had begun to change tactics yet again. It was important to address this shift directly in my opening statement. Today's hearing is our 7th. We have covered significant ground over the past several weeks, And we have also seen a change in how witnesses and lawyers in the Trump orbit approach this committee. Initially, their strategy in some cases appeared to be to deny and delay. Today, there appears to be a general recognition that the committee has established key facts, including that virtually everyone close to President Trump, his Justice Department officials, his White House advisors, his White House counsel, his campaign, all told him the 2020 election was not stolen. This appears to have changed the strategy for defending Donald Trump. Now the argument seems to be that President Trump was manipulated by others outside the administration, that he was persuaded to ignore his closest advisors, and that he was incapable of telling right from wrong. This new strategy is to try to blame only John Eastman or Sidney Powell or Congressman Scott Perry or others, and not President Trump. In this version, the president was, quote, poorly served by these outside advisors. The strategy is to blame people his advisors called, quote, the crazies for what Donald Trump did. This, of course, is nonsense. President Trump is a 76-year-old man. He is not an impressionable child. Just like everyone else in our country, he is responsible for his own actions and his own choices. As our investigation has shown, Donald Trump had access to more detailed and specific information showing that the election was not actually stolen than almost any other American, and he was told this over and over again. No rational or sane man in his position could disregard that information and reach the opposite conclusion. Our July 12th hearing began with testimony from high-level Trump administration officials, including Labor Secretary Jean Scalia, White House counsel Pat Cipollone, Ivanka Trump, Attorney General Bill Barr, and others. They all believed that Donald Trump should have conceded the election by December 14th, the date on which the Electoral College met and voted and declared Joe Biden the victor. Featuring testimony from Trump White House staffers, the July 12th hearing demonstrated yet again that Trump had been told repeatedly that there was no evidence to support the stolen election claims. Trump did not care. He ignored all of them. He made a conscious choice to continue with his January 6th strategy. He hosted a wild and highly contentious showdown at the White House on December 18th between his White House legal team on one hand and Sidney Powell, Mike Flynn, Rudy Giuliani, and conspiracy theorist Patrick Byrne on the other. Shortly after that meeting ended, in the early hours of December 19th, Trump sent his tweet inviting supporters to come to Washington for a wild event on January 6th. This tweet immediately triggered planning by militia groups and many others and led to the violence 2 weeks later. This hearing, which was expertly led by Jamie Raskin and Stephanie Murphy, also walked in detail through the involvement of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers on January 6th. In particular, how they planned for that day and how they led the crowd that Donald Trump had sent to the Capitol into the building. Key members of both groups have since been convicted of the crime of seditious conspiracy. We continued with poignant testimony by former Trump supporters, including Ohio resident Stephen Ayers, a self-described family man, who accepted Donald Trump's invitation to come to Washington for January 6th. These men and women ruined their lives by following Donald Trump, by doing what he wanted them to do. Ayers walked the panel through his experience that day, explaining that he was following every word of Donald Trump's instructions. Ayers would not have violated the law, nor later lost his job, he said, had Trump simply instructed the rioters to leave at 1:30 p.m., by which time Trump knew that violence had erupted. Ayers further testified that Trump's 4:17 p.m. video and tweet, at long last instructing his supporters to leave, had a dramatic effect on him and others. We literally left right after that came out, he said, as did many of the other rioters. As the January 6th committee brought its July 12th hearing to a close, I needed to do one more thing. We had learned that following our prior hearing, Donald Trump had attempted to contact a committee witness, a witness we had not yet identified in any hearing. I announced publicly that we had alerted the Department of Justice to Trump's call. We would not stand for efforts by Donald Trump or anyone else to try to intimidate or tamper with our witnesses. Our last hearing in July, on Thursday the 21st, may well have been our most important. All Americans should watch it. We now had testimony from White House counsel Pat Cipollone, leaving no doubt that all of Trump's senior White House staff were saying essentially the same thing during the violence. They were desperately trying to persuade President Trump to instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. This evidence cannot be rebutted. In this hearing, we walked systematically through the 3-hour period while rioters attacked police and invaded the Capitol. We walked through phone calls begging Trump to help. We walked through a cascade of important texts from Trump supporters and family. We examined all the tweets. We scrutinized what Donald Trump's staff and his family had said. There was a staff-written note begging the president to instruct the rioters to leave the Capitol. The mounting violence had clearly frightened House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner told the Select Committee. When he couldn't persuade Trump to help, Kevin desperately called Trump's family and begged them to intervene. Virtually everyone knew what needed to be done, and yet the evidence showed that Trump was making phone calls instead, belatedly still trying to convince senators to further delay the electoral count. There is only one reasonable conclusion from this mountain of evidence. Donald Trump wanted the electoral count to stop, and he knew the rioters were the only thing stopping it. This is why Trump did not pick up the phone and order federal law enforcement or the military to intervene. This is why he would not instruct his supporters to stand down and leave. We also showed that Trump was fully aware of the ongoing violence when he sent his infamous 2:24 p.m. tweet attacking Vice President Pence for cowardice. One of our witnesses, former Deputy White House Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, said this about Donald Trump's tweet.
You know, I worked on the campaign, traveled all around the country, going to countless rallies with him, and I've seen the impact that his words have on his supporters. They truly latch on to every word and every tweet that he says, and so I think that in that moment, for him to tweet out the message about Mike Pence, it was him pouring gasoline on the fire and making it much worse.
Even Trump's far-right ally, Ali Alexander, who was outside the Capitol building, texted, "POTUS is not ignorant of what his words would do." Not one person we interviewed on President Trump's White House staff could find any excuse for the 2:24 p.m. tweet. They universally condemned it. Well, after all of this, during his May 2023 CNN town hall, Donald Trump admitted that his supporters follow every word he says. And, as the Select Committee concluded, on January 6th, Donald Trump was trying to threaten and endanger Pence's life in order to pressure him to violate the law. During the violent chaos and even after it, Trump and his lawyers, Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman, all continued to pressure Congress and Mike Pence to delay the electoral count. In our committee's final report, we cited a legal analysis by Professor Emeritus Albert Altshuler, one of our country's leading professors of criminal law. As a law student at the University of Chicago in the mid-1990s, I had taken Professor Altshuler's course in criminal law. Altshuler suggested that Donald Trump's intentional failure to stop the violence could constitute assisting or giving aid or comfort to an insurrection under the U.S. Criminal Code. The committee concluded that Trump knew what was happening at the U.S. Capitol and knew what he needed to do to stop it. He refused. Leading the questioning in the July 21st hearing were Congressman Adam Kinzinger and Congresswoman Elaine Luria, both military veterans. Before being elected to Congress, Elaine had served in the Navy for 20 years, including as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, and had risen to the rank of commander. I had gotten to know her during our time together on the Armed Services Committee, where we had all benefited from her expertise and her dedication to serving her constituents and our country. Chairman Thompson asked Kinzinger and Luria to lead this hearing in part because he knew their experiences serving in the military brought an important understanding to issues related to the dereliction of duty by our commander-in-chief. The hearing also demonstrated the shameful immorality of those, like Senator Josh Hawley, who first provoked the riotous crowd with a raised fist and then ran from the crowd once he realized what was happening. A member of the Capitol Police told us that Senator Hawley's fist pump from behind police lines bothered her greatly because he riled up the crowd and was, quote, doing it in a safe space, protected by the officers and the barriers. When the committee showed footage of Hawley's gesture, then followed it immediately with footage of Hawley running down a Capitol hallway, the hearing room erupted in laughter. Hawley deserved it. Legendary former Missouri Republican Senator Jack Danforth said of Hawley after the January 6 riots, supporting Josh and trying so hard to get him elected to the Senate was the worst mistake I ever made in my life. In my closing statement, I intended to make several points, not just about the evidence we had presented over the past 2 months, but about how we had uncovered the truth over the past year. We've seen bravery and honor in these hearings, and Ms. Matthews and Mr. Pottinger, both of you will be remembered for that, as will Cassidy Hutchinson. She sat here alone, took the oath, and testified before millions of Americans. She knew all along that she would be attacked by President Trump and by the 50, 60, and 70-year-old men who hide themselves behind executive privilege. But like our witnesses today, she has courage, and she did it anyway. Cassidy, Sarah, and our other witnesses, including Officer Caroline Edwards, Shay Moss, and her mother, Ruby Freeman, are an inspiration to American women and to American girls. We owe a debt to all of those who have and will appear here. And that brings me to another point. This committee has shown you the testimony of dozens of Republican witnesses, those who served President Trump loyally for years. The case against Donald Trump in these hearings is not made by witnesses who were his political enemies. It is instead a series of confessions by Donald Trump's own appointees, his own friends, his own campaign officials, people who worked for him for years, and his own family. I also intended to address people like Hugh Hewitt, on whose nationwide radio program for conservative listeners I had appeared many times. I was convinced that people like Hewitt agreed with most of what I was saying about Trump, but could not say so without risking a revolt by their listeners. It seemed a number of conservative writers, analysts, and media personalities clung to whatever rationale they could to attack what I was doing and to avoid engaging with our evidence. They urged their viewers not to watch our hearings, claiming, for example, we, quote, had no cross-examination. Ironically, this was Kevin McCarthy's doing. He had chosen to withdraw all 5 of his Republican nominees to the committee a year earlier. Nor was this a circumstance where we relied on testimony from Donald Trump's political opponents. We had intentionally structured our hearings around dozens of unimpeachable witnesses, Donald Trump's own supporters, his own appointees, his own advisors. I wanted conservatives who were finding excuses to ignore us to ask themselves a key question. For those of you who seem to think the evidence would be different if Republican leader McCarthy had not withdrawn his nominees from this committee, let me ask you this. Do you really think Bill Barr is such a delicate flower that he would wilt under cross-examination? Pat Cipollone, Eric Hirschman, Jeff Rosen, Richard Donahue, of course they aren't. None of our witnesses are. Of course, the larger and much more important issue for this hearing was what Donald Trump failed to do during the attack. I focused on that in my concluding remarks. In our hearing tonight, you saw an American president faced with a stark and unmistakable choice between right and wrong. There was no ambiguity, no nuance. Donald Trump made a purposeful choice to violate his oath of office, to ignore the ongoing violence against law enforcement, to threaten our constitutional order. There is no way to excuse that behavior. It was indefensible. And every American must consider this. Can a president who is willing to make the choices Donald Trump made during the violence of January 6th ever be trusted with any position of authority in our great nation again? This is exactly the question we still face as I write Oath and Honor, more than a year after our July 2022 hearings concluded. I believed then, and still believe today, that we are dealing with a larger question, not just one man's effort to subvert our constitutional republic, but the commitment of all Americans to the rule of law and the premises of our Constitution. As we ended, I tried to put the issues we had been tackling in a larger historical context. In this room, in 1918, the Committee on Women's Suffrage convened to discuss and debate whether women should be granted the right to vote. This room is full of history, and we on this committee know we have a solemn obligation not to idly squander what so many Americans have fought and died for. Ronald Reagan's great ally, Margaret Thatcher, said this: "Let it never be said that the dedication of those who love freedom is less than the determination of those who would destroy it." Let me assure every one of you this: our committee understands the gravity of this moment, the consequences for our nation. In the days that followed, Trump defenders largely went silent. Most national media fully grasped what we had showed. One commentator wrote that the committee's presentation proved that we had understood the assignment, that our job was not to grandstand or gloat, but to create a thorough historical record that all Americans could understand. To this day, the evidence from this final summer hearing is among the most potent information I can share with Americans who still think that Donald Trump has been railroaded, or that January 6th was a sightseeing visit by tourists engaged in legitimate political discourse. Most people who will take the time to listen realize that there is no excuse or defense for Donald Trump's unwillingness to step to the microphone and instruct the rioters to leave. A man who would behave that way when his character is tested lacks the sense of right and wrong that most Americans learn from their parents. 53. Freedom must not and will not die here. During World War II, the Heart Mountain Relocation Center was located about 15 miles outside Cody, Wyoming. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government began forcibly evacuating and detaining individuals of Japanese ancestry. More than 110,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in 10 camps in isolated areas of the country. Heart Mountain was a destination for over 14,000 of them. Among those detained at Heart Mountain was a 10-year-old boy who had been born in California. When he boarded the train with his family in San Jose in the spring of 1942, he was wearing his Cub Scout uniform and carrying his baseball bat and glove. Military sentries confiscated the bat as a potential weapon. By November, Norman Yoshio Mineta and his family had arrived in the Heart Mountain camp. The Boy Scout troops in the camp tried to get troops from the nearby towns of Cody and Powell to join them for activities. All the other troops declined the invitation, except one from Cody, where a young Alan Simpson was a member. Al Simpson and Norm Mineta formed a lifelong friendship. Simpson, a Republican, grew up to represent Wyoming in the United States Senate. Mineta, a Democrat, was elected to Congress and served in the cabinet of 2 American presidents, one Democrat and one Republican. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Secretary of Transportation Norm Mineta sat with my father, Vice President Richard Cheney, in the secure bunker underneath the White House, orchestrating the unprecedented effort to get every American commercial aircraft out of the sky while our nation was under attack by al-Qaeda. A few days after our last July hearing, I was honored to participate in a ceremony at the Heart Mountain Camp to break ground for the Mineta-Simpson Institute, celebrating the lifelong friendship of these 2 men. Hundreds of family members of those who had been interned, as well as a few camp survivors themselves, gathered under a large tent on the high plains where the Heart Mountain Relocation Center had once stood. I sat on stage next to Senator Simpson and Norm Mineta's wife, Denny. When I was introduced, the audience rose in a loud, sustained ovation. I hadn't expected this, and it was overwhelming. It was a very emotional moment for me. I spotted my father in the audience, standing with the crowd. It was emotional for him, too. Many of the people who came up to me afterward expressed a gratitude informed by what their families had suffered. They were Americans who had lost their freedom, who had seen everything taken from them by their own government. Given what their families had endured, their deep love of the United States was humbling, and their warnings about how quickly it could all be lost resonated with me deeply. Later that same day, David and Christine Fales hosted me at a meet and greet at their home. Chairs had been set up on their front lawn. Off to one side was a table with punch and snacks. Near the microphone, set up for my remarks, stood an American flag and a large, beautiful photograph of a bald eagle taken by one of their 4 sons. It was a perfect Wyoming summer evening with friends and family, Democrats and Republicans together, talking about our love of America and all we must do to protect her. The Fales are the parents of 11 children. As a mother of 5, I don't often meet parents with more children than Phil and I have, and I always take the opportunity to compare notes. As the event was winding down, Christine and I were talking about our children. "I've realized something about you," she said. "You will never stop fighting for America because you have a mother's love for our country." It was the highest compliment I could imagine. With just a few weeks to go before the primary election, we decided to make 2 final ads. I knew I had a steep uphill climb. I had not charted my course with the goal of being reelected. I was doing my duty. I wanted the language of the ads to explain why the truth matters and why the lies about the 2020 election were so dangerous. If we do not condemn these lies, if we do not hold those responsible to account, we will be excusing this conduct, and it will become a feature of all elections. America will never be the same. A substantial majority of Wyoming Republican primary voters would disagree with that sentiment. I knew when we ran the ad. This was no way to win an election in Wyoming, but I refused to hedge the truth. The final ad of the campaign featured Dick Cheney wearing his Stetson and speaking directly to the camera about the threat our country faced.
In our nation's 246-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. He tried to steal the last election using lies and violence to keep himself in power after the voters had rejected him. He is a coward. A real man wouldn't lie to his supporters. He lost his election, and he lost big. I know it, he knows it, and deep down, I think most Republicans know it. Lynn and I are so proud of Liz for standing up for the truth, doing what's right, honoring her oath to the Constitution, when so many in our party are too scared to do so. Liz is fearless. She never backs down from a fight. There is nothing more important she will ever do than lead the effort to make sure Donald Trump is never again near the Oval Office. And she will succeed. I am Dick Cheney. I proudly voted for my daughter. I hope you will too.
The Wind River Reservation occupies more than 2 million acres near the center of Wyoming. It's shared by two tribes, the Northern Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone. During my time in Congress, I worked closely with tribal members and leaders to learn about the challenges they faced and to do everything I could to ensure I was an effective representative for them. I'd worked especially closely with tribal chairman Lee Spoonhunter and Jordan Dresser, who led the Northern Arapaho tribe during my time in office. In July, they told me the tribe would like to honor me during its annual powwow on the reservation at Ethity, Wyoming. Before the ceremony, I talked with a young woman who had been one of the recipients of a scholarship my parents had endowed at the University of Wyoming for students to study abroad. A member of the Arapaho tribe, she was a law student at UW and had used some of the scholarship funds to visit the United Kingdom. She described visiting a British museum warehouse on the outskirts of London. Curators there had brought a sacred item out of storage, a headdress once worn by Chief Yellowcalf, the last chief of the Arapaho. She was the first member of the Arapaho tribe to see the headdress in over 100 years. Now she was doing all she could to secure the return of the headdress to the Arapaho tribe. Although my term would be up in months, I worked to help. As I write this, the headdress remains packed away in that museum warehouse. Given the artifact's significance to the history of the Northern Arapaho, that seems especially wrong. The honor ceremony in Ethity that day was very moving. A woman wrapped a red blanket with white fringe made for the ceremony around my shoulders. Drums sounded as tribal elders and leaders escorted me in a solemn walk around the arena. Members of the tribe stepped down from the stands to shake our hands and join the procession. On August 8, 2022, a team of federal agents conducted a lawful search of Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. At the time, we didn't know the full extent of Donald Trump's obstruction of efforts by the Department of Justice to retrieve classified documents from him. But Trump's response to the raid was no surprise. He claimed he was a victim. Trump's victim strategy had enjoyed ringing success in deep red states such as Wyoming, and at least one violent assault on an FBI field office had ensued. But now he weaponized that strategy by working to publicly disclose a number of the FBI agents who had been involved in the search. Mobilize the anger, put people's lives at risk, make them pay. How many times had the January 6th committee seen precisely that tactic before? I suspected that the agents and their families, agents who had devoted their lives to law enforcement and were simply doing their jobs, would face the same type of harassment we had seen inflicted on Speaker Bowers, Shea Moss, Ruby Freeman, and dozens of others. And other Republicans were joining in, following Donald Trump's lead, attacking the integrity of FBI agents involved in the search. Donald Trump's outing of the agents had been purposeful and malicious. In public remarks a few days later, I warned of the danger to law enforcement and to our nation as a whole. Today, our federal law enforcement is being threatened. A federal judge is being threatened. Fresh threats of violence arise everywhere. And despite knowing all of this, Donald Trump recently released the names of the FBI agents involved in the search. That was purposeful and malicious. No patriotic American should excuse these threats or be intimidated by them. Our great nation must not be ruled by a mob provoked over social media. Of course, today we know far more about that document search, and Donald Trump has now been indicted, including for obstruction of justice and violations of the Espionage Act. One of the allegations, that Trump caused his lawyers to provide a false certification to the Department of Justice, reminds me of the type of deceit our January 6th investigation uncovered. And Donald Trump is also now attacking and endangering the Department of Justice lawyers prosecuting him. As the Republican primary in Wyoming approached, friends, family, and staff gathered in Jackson Hole. The night before the election, we hosted a dinner in a restaurant on the Jackson Town Square. It was clear what the outcome would be the next day. but the mood was neither sad nor somber. I was proud of and humbled by the support of these wonderful men and women. We'd been through a lot together over the last many months. Members of my staff, both on Capitol Hill and in Wyoming, had weathered harassment, including from family members who were angry that they'd stayed with me. Before joining my team, many of these staffers had worked in Republican politics or in Republican offices on Capitol Hill. It would no doubt have been easier for them to keep their heads down and quietly go to work for someone else. I certainly would have understood. I felt grateful and honored that we had stood together. In the shadow of the Grand Tetons outside Jackson, Wyoming, on some of the most beautiful land in America, sits the Meade Ranch. Nestled against the East Grovant Butte, the cattle ranch has been in the Meade family for over 100 years. When Phil and I got married in Jackson 30 years ago, our rehearsal dinner was at Spring Creek Ranch, atop the butte overlooking the Meade Ranch. The Meade family has been involved in service to Wyoming for generations. Matt Meade was U.S. Attorney for Wyoming and then governor of the state from 2011 to 2019. His grandfather, Cliff Hansen, served as the state's governor and as one of our senators in the 1960s and 1970s. After a young Dick Cheney visited the older man in his Senate office on Capitol Hill in the late 1960s, Senator Hansen wrote to my grandparents to say what an impressive young man he had found their son to be. I still have that letter. The Meades had graciously agreed to host our election night event. As the sun sank behind the mountains at the end of that summer day, the few clouds were lit by pink dusk light. I had never seen a more beautiful evening in Wyoming. Donald Trump's refusal to concede a political campaign that he had resoundingly lost was un-American and dishonorable, and it had devastating consequences for our country. Resolved to concede my own race definitively and unconditionally, I began my election night speech this way. 2 years ago, I won this primary with 73% of the vote. I could easily have done the same again. The path was clear. But it would have required that I go along with President Trump's lie about the 2020 election. It would have required that I enable his ongoing efforts to unravel our democratic system and attack the foundations of our republic. That was a path I could not and would not take. No House seat, no office in this land is more important than the principles that we are all sworn to protect. And I well understood the potential political consequences of abiding by my duty. Our republic relies upon the goodwill of all candidates for office to accept honorably the outcome of elections. And tonight, Harriet Hageman has received the most votes in this primary. She won. I called her to concede the race. My congressional race was over, but our work to defend our democratic republic was only just beginning. Because America's democratic system has endured longer than any in history, it can be easy to take its survival for granted. Sometimes people would tell me that January 6th wasn't so bad because, after all, our institutions had held. I would remind them that our institutions don't defend themselves. The institutions held only because of a handful of Americans who did their duty and refused to yield to Donald Trump's pressure, and because of the men and women in law enforcement who literally defended our democracy when it came under attack. American freedom is precious and rare, and active vigilance is required from all of us to defend it. As I spoke that night, we were facing a particular danger in the form of candidates who were still refusing to accept the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Should any of these election deniers be elected governor or secretary of state in swing states such as Arizona or Pennsylvania, they could inflict enormous damage in 2024 by, for example, honoring election results only if their preferred candidate won. They had to be defeated. Describing how fragile and rare our freedom is, I continued. Most of world history is a story of violent conflict, of servitude and suffering. Most people in most places have not lived in freedom. Our American freedom is a providential departure from history. We are the exception. We have been given the gift of freedom by God and our founding fathers. It has been said that the long arc of history bends toward justice and freedom. That's true, but only if we make it bend. Today, our highest duty is to bend the arc of history to preserve our nation and its blessings, to ensure that freedom will not perish, to protect the very foundations of this constitutional republic. Never in our nation's 246 years have we seen what we saw on January 6th. Like so many Americans, I assumed that the violence and the chaos of that day would have prompted a united response, a recognition that this was a line that must never be crossed, a tragic chapter in our nation's history to be studied by historians to ensure that it can never happen again. But instead, major elements of my party still vehemently defend those who caused it. At the heart of the attack on January 6th is a willingness to embrace dangerous conspiracies that attack the very core premise of our nation, that lawful elections, reviewed by the courts when necessary and certified by the states and electoral college, determine who serves as president. If we do not condemn the conspiracies and the lies, if we do not hold those responsible to account, we will be excusing this conduct, and it will become a feature of all elections. America will never be the same. Today, as we meet here, there are Republican candidates for governor who deny the outcome of the 2020 election and who may refuse to certify future elections if they oppose the results. We have candidates for Secretary of State who may refuse to report the actual results of the popular vote in future elections. And we have candidates for Congress, including here in Wyoming, who refuse to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the 2020 election and suggest that states decertify their results. Our nation is barreling once again towards crisis, lawlessness, and violence. No American should support election deniers for any position of genuine responsibility where their refusal to follow the rule of law will corrupt our future. Our nation is young in the history of mankind, and yet we're the oldest democracy in the world. Our survival is not guaranteed. History has shown us over and over again how poisonous lies destroy free nations. I knew my address would also be carried by national and international media. I wanted to explain to the crowd and to all those watching why I had decided to take this course and what I saw as our essential next steps. Our duty as citizens of this republic is not only to defend the freedom that's been handed down to us. We also have an obligation to learn from the actions of those who came before, to know the stories of grit and perseverance, of the brave men and women who built and saved this union. In the lives of these great Americans, we find inspiration and purpose. In May of 1864, after years of war and a string of reluctant Union generals, Ulysses S. Grant met General Lee's forces at the Battle of the Wilderness. In 2 days of heavy fighting, the Union suffered over 17,000 casualties. At the end of that battle, General Grant faced a choice. Most assumed he would do what previous Union generals had done and retreat. On the evening of May 7th, Grant began to move. As the fires of the battle still smoldered, Grant rode to the head of the column. He rode to the intersection of Brock Road and Orange Plank Road. And there, as the men of his army watched and waited, instead of turning north back towards Washington and safety, Grant turned his horse south toward Richmond and the heart of Lee's army. Refusing to retreat, he pressed on to victory. Lincoln and Grant and all who fought in our nation's tragic Civil War including my own great-great-grandfathers, saved our Union. Their courage saved freedom. And if we listen closely, they are speaking to us down the generations. We must not idly squander what so many have fought and died for. America has meant so much to so many because we are the best hope of freedom on earth. Last week in Laramie, a gentleman came up to me with tears in his eyes. "I'm not an American," he said, "but my children are. I grew up in Brazil. I know how fragile freedom is, and we must not lose it here." A few days ago, here in Jackson, a woman told me that her grandparents had survived Auschwitz. They found refuge in America. She said she was afraid that she had nowhere to go if freedom died here. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom must not, cannot, and will not die here. We must be very clear-eyed about the threat we face and about what is required to defeat it. I have said since January 6th that I will do whatever it takes to ensure Donald Trump is never again anywhere near the Oval Office, and I mean it. This is a fight for all of us together. I'm a conservative Republican. I believe deeply in the principles and the ideals on which my party was founded. I love its history, and I love what our party has stood for. But I love my country more. So I ask you tonight to join me. As we leave here, let us resolve that we will stand together, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, against those who would destroy our republic. They are angry and they are determined, but they have not seen anything like the power of Americans united in defense of our Constitution and committed to the cause of freedom. There is no greater power on this earth, and with God's help, we will prevail. Thank you all. God bless you. God bless Wyoming. God bless the United States of America. Thank you, guys. Thank you. By the time I left the stage, the sun had set behind the mountains. I waded through the crowd, hugging supporters who had stood with me for years. Paul and Judy Calley from Cody, John and Mary Kay Turner and Jackie Montgomery from Jackson, my dear college friend Liza Poley and her daughter Eliza, and many other close friends. We all knew that we were standing at the beginning, not the end, of the work that will be necessary to defend our Constitution. 54. You're welcome, Carrie Lake. For months, pollsters had predicted that Republicans would retake the U.S. House of Representatives in 2022 by double digits, with some estimating gains as high as 30 congressional seats. History seemed to support that prediction for an off-year election. Normally, the party in the White House loses seats in Congress. As the election approached, some pollsters also had the Arizona Republican candidate for governor, Carrie Lake, an election denier, up by at least a few points. To combat election deniers and help educate voters about all that was at stake, I formed a political action committee, or PAC, called the Great Task, named for Lincoln's description from his Gettysburg Address of the great task remaining before us, to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I'd accepted an invitation to speak at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University on October 5th, 2022. During the event, I was asked about Carrie Lake and another election denier, Mark Fincham, who was running for Secretary of State. They had both fully embraced election denialism, and they posed a significant threat. My speech was covered in Arizona, but as the election drew closer, the Great Task cut an ad using clips from my Arizona speech and ran it, beginning about a week before Election Day. I don't know that I have ever voted for a Democrat, but if I lived in Arizona, I absolutely would. You have a candidate for governor, Kari Lake. You have a candidate for Secretary of State, Mark Finchem, both of whom have said that they will only honor the results of an election if they agree with it. And if you care about the survival of our republic, we cannot give people power who will not honor elections. We must have elected officials who honor that responsibility. Lake fired off a sarcastic open letter in response, thanking me for my generous in-kind contribution to her campaign and suggesting that my ad would move even more people to vote for her. In fact, she wrote, my team tells me that your commercial should add another 10 points to our lead. Thank you again for the huge boost to our campaign. P.S. Make Arizona great again. Lake seemed to think she was already up by 10 points over her Democratic opponent, Katie Hobbs. I doubted it, but polling did suggest that Lake was in the lead. Yet when the votes were counted the next week, Kari Lake lost. So did Mark Finchem. Whatever Lake's lead in the polls may have once been, it disappeared during the last week of her campaign. When Lake's defeat was officially announced, I responded to her earlier sarcastic thank you letter with a tweet. You're welcome, Kari Lake. During each of my 3 terms in the House, I had served on the Armed Services Committee. Armed Services is different from other House committees in a number of important ways. Many members on the committee are veterans themselves or have a background in national security or intelligence. The work of the committee has historically been less overtly partisan than that of some other House committees. During my years on the Armed Services Committee, I got to know a core group of colleagues who happened to be women, Democrats and Republicans, who were serious and knowledgeable about the issues. We certainly didn't always agree, but I respected their expertise and their dedication to serving their constituents and our country. One of these Armed Services Committee colleagues was Democrat Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan. Alyssa had served at the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Department, and on the National Security Council. She worked for President Bush and President Obama. Her Republican opponent was an election denier who had refused to accept the results of the 2020 presidential election and declined to say whether he would honor the outcome of the 2022 congressional election. Despite our policy disagreements, I was honored to endorse Alyssa. It was the first time I had ever endorsed a Democrat, but I knew that no policy debate was as important as standing together across party lines on behalf of democracy. On November 1st, 2022, I traveled to East Lansing and spoke at an event on Alyssa's behalf. Alyssa won her race. Another Democrat I endorsed in 2022 was Abigail Spanberger. Abigail had worked as a CIA officer for many years. I respected her level-headedness and devotion to public service. I knew she understood how perilous this moment was for our nation. She was exactly the kind of person the country needed in Congress. Abigail faced a tight re-election race in 2022. Her opponent was an election denier who'd been endorsed by Donald Trump on October 27th. A week later, I endorsed Abigail, saying, "We need our elected leaders to be honest, serious, and responsible, which is why I would urge voters in Virginia's 7th District to support Abigail Spanberger." Abigail prevailed, garnering 52% of the vote to her opponent's 48%. As these 2 races demonstrate, 2022 did not turn out to be a typical midterm election. The expectations that Republicans would flip dozens of seats in Congress, as expert pollsters had maintained right up until Election Day, collapsed. Election deniers were defeated in many races. From all these races, I recognized that a significant number of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, would never embrace the lies of Donald Trump or other election deniers. 55. They knew. Throughout the summer of 2022, it became increasingly clear that text messages among Secret Service agents on January 6th had been destroyed. We had seen reports that a criminal investigation had been initiated relating to the missing texts. The deletion of these texts was certainly suspicious, and it made our job much more difficult. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas called Chairman Thompson and me, as well as others on the committee, and pledged to help in any way he could. Among other things, he appointed a former DHS General Counsel, Steve Bunnell, to help us navigate these and related issues with the department. Joe Maher had joined my committee staff from the department, and he was recused from any matters connected to DHS, so I dealt with much of this directly. I had been in Wyoming for a good portion of August, and I was concerned that the January 6th committee was not making much progress with Homeland Security's offers to help us. I spoke with Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren about this, and we set up a call with Bunnell and DHS General Counsel Jonathan Meyer over the Labor Day weekend. Bunnell and Meyer moved quickly to ensure the committee received additional Secret Service emails and other electronic messages. We could not recover the destroyed text messages. Although they could have been incredibly valuable, they were apparently gone forever. But we could do the next best thing by obtaining and reviewing the emails and other messages that DHS made available to the committee. Within the next few weeks, we received approximately 1 million new emails, radio transmissions, chat messages, and other documents from the Secret Service. We recognized that this was an extraordinary step for the Homeland Security Department. The Secret Service normally refuses to produce this type of material, which included intelligence and law enforcement sensitive information, and does so only when compelled by a court. Their decision to provide it to the Select Committee reflected the gravity of the issues we were addressing. As the material began to arrive, I was trying to jumpstart our team to plow through these critical new documents. Jamie Fleet worked with my Chief of Staff, Kara Ahern, to dedicate additional resources and staff to review the newly produced documents. I went to the staff offices in September to help sift through the materials myself. What we found was important. There was no doubt about it. In the days leading up to January 6th, and on that morning itself, the Secret Service was receiving warnings about the potential for violence, and the White House personnel interacting with them knew it. They knew. This was not just a single stray report or one isolated intelligence analysis. Instead, the signs were many. The potential for violence should not have been a surprise. Indeed, based on communications among Trump supporters identified in the intelligence and threat reporting, it was entirely predictable. The White House knew more than enough to cancel President Trump's ellipse speech on January 6th. They knew more than enough to realize that sending the ellipse crowd to the Capitol could be exceptionally dangerous. This was obviously a disaster waiting to happen. Rational people in the White House, or a rational president, easily could have prevented it. To be clear, the issue was not that the Secret Service failed to brief those up the chain at the White House about the threat. It appeared to the committee that this information was being conveyed up the chain, including directly to Mark Meadows and President Trump. We presented explicit testimony about that topic in our hearings. With the weight of the intelligence we received via Homeland Security, it is exceptionally difficult to believe that anyone in the White House with access to this information could have failed to recognize this obvious menace. It is also extremely difficult to believe that Mark Meadows, Donald Trump, and others were not briefed. I was concerned, even without access to this intelligence, about what might happen on January 6th. So concerned, in fact, that I hired private security for that day. I would invite anyone who still harbors doubts to read the final report of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, and in particular, to download and read the November 29, 2022, recorded examination by Chief Investigative Counsel Tim Hafey of White House Deputy Chief of Staff Tony Ornato. They knew. The bottom line is this: Donald Trump never should have summoned his supporters to Washington for January 6th. And as it became clear that they were angry and could suddenly turn violent, he should have canceled his ellipse speech and told them to leave town. He never should have addressed the crowd the way he did. He never should have instructed them to march to the Capitol. And once the violence erupted, he should have intervened and instructed them to leave the Capitol immediately, certainly when he was informed that a riot was underway. Certainly, at the moment, Pat Cipollone and others on his staff pleaded with him to do so. And Donald Trump never should have poured gasoline on the fire by tweeting his attack on Mike Pence at 2:24 p.m. At 2:44 p.m. on January 6th, at the height of the deadly violence, Ashley Babbitt attempted to invade the House chamber, climbing through the shattered glass window of a locked door, ignoring the warnings of a lone Capitol Police officer guarding the door with his weapon drawn. Other officers with weapons drawn were defending a second door from rioters attempting to break in. Members of Congress were in the chamber at the time, while others were being evacuated through the far door. In the prior 1 to 2 hours, Metropolitan Police had found firearms on Trump supporters in the streets. The rioters outside the Capitol had begun physically assaulting police officers, and their numbers were so overwhelming that they had severely injured many officers. More than 1,000 rioters, and possibly as many as 2,000, had already forced their way inside the Capitol. Some were hunting Mike Pence. Others were trying to infiltrate the House and Senate chambers. An armed standoff was playing out at the chamber's north door. Suffocating tear gas swirled through the Capitol rotunda. If a riotous crowd like this had breached the White House grounds, was attacking police, was breaking windows to gain entry to the White House itself, and then had entered the White House through a broken window, the Secret Service would have been fully justified in using lethal force, as the Capitol Police officer did here. Donald Trump has repeatedly said he blames Ashley Babbitt's death on the Capitol Police. Yet if anyone other than Ashley Babbitt is responsible for her death, it is Donald Trump. She died trying to keep Donald Trump in office. She died because she believed Donald Trump's lies. Donald Trump could have and should have put a stop to all of this before she died. This was his responsibility. 56. State of mind. The January 6th committee conducted a business meeting on October 13, 2022. The committee had a number of options for structuring this meeting. We had secured new documentary evidence from the National Archives and the Secret Service. We also had heard new evidence directly relevant to Donald Trump's intent, including from Trump confidant Steve Bannon and conservative activist Tom Fitton. And we also now had video from Fort McNair, where the most senior Democratic and Republican leaders had been evacuated during the violent riot. By this point in the fall, we were confident that the Department of Justice was pursuing the same investigative paths we were. We wanted to be certain that they had the benefit of our thinking. We also thought that some state prosecutors had begun to look into the topics we were covering. We thought our most important role now might be to put all of our most important evidence, new and old, in its proper context. That is, to show precisely how it fit into the larger evidentiary picture. The easiest way to do that, and the way we thought might be most helpful to criminal prosecutors, would be to itemize key evidence relevant to Donald Trump's intent, his state of mind. The addition of evidence relating to Trump advisors Steve Bannon, Tom Fitton, and Roger Stone was particularly relevant. It confirmed that Donald Trump's election night strategy had been premeditated. During the Select Committee's meeting on October 13, 2022, we also showed the public a number of the newly obtained Secret Service documents. These bore directly upon the depravity of Donald Trump's actions on January 6th, proving that those in the White House knew there was a substantial risk of violence. We also presented other evidence demonstrating that Trump had been aware his election claims were false, including new evidence of conversations with Mark Meadows, revealing what Trump knew and thought. The January 6th committee also decided to issue a subpoena to Donald Trump. Over the course of our committee's work, Trump had challenged members of the committee to debate him and suggested that he would be more than happy to testify. The time had now come for Trump to either appear before the committee or admit that he had been bluffing. To bolster the committee's request for Trump's testimony, we presented material from a series of witnesses, among them General Flynn and Roger Stone. Each of them had invoked their Fifth Amendment rights in declining to answer questions about their direct communications with the president. We had long suspected Trump and Meadows of having communicated with Flynn and Stone in advance of January 6th. Both Flynn and Stone had been seen with members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. We had direct testimony indicating that Trump asked Meadows to call Flynn and Stone on the night of January 5th. But because Flynn and Stone took the 5th, and because Meadows refused to testify and Justice declined to prosecute, we had no further details about those communications. Both the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers had played key roles in the Capitol assault. Members of each of those two far-right militias had been convicted of seditious conspiracy. We all suspected there was more to this story. For these and other reasons, the committee did not feel that we could close our investigation of January 6th without seeking direct testimony from Donald Trump. As it turned out, Donald Trump's earlier posturing was just posturing. 57. Never again. Our committee's mandate required that we conduct an investigation and that our investigation inform future potential legislation. That's exactly what we did. What Donald Trump attempted to do in 2020 and 2021 was unconstitutional and illegal under existing laws. But what if the plan was different next time? What if one or more sitting state governors refused to certify a lawful election result? What if a state's Secretary of State opted not to report the lawful outcome of the popular vote? Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren and I, assisted by my senior counsel Joe Maher and Giancarlo Pellegrini and Sean Wright from the House Administration Committee, discussed how we might fill these holes, including introducing legislation to modify the 1887 Electoral Count Act. Consulting with legal scholars from across the political spectrum, Zoe's team produced a strong initial draft. Phil, Joe, and I worked to edit it. Here's how I characterized the resulting proposed bill on the House floor on September 21st. Commentary from conservatives on our bill has been exceptionally positive. Here are a few examples. Judge Ludig, a widely respected conservative legal expert, wrote that our bill was, quote, masterfully drafted to ensure we never have another day anything like January 6th, and to avert other future efforts to overturn our nation's democratic elections. The Wall Street Journal editorial board offered a range of positive comments, including explaining that the House bill would make it harder, quote, for partisans in Congress who want to get C-SPAN famous to lodge phony Electoral College objections, or for them to raise objections on the House floor because, quote, somebody had a funny feeling about the vote totals in west-southeastern Pennsylvania. The conservative Cato Institute said this, quote, in some respects, this bill is more conservative and originalist than the existing Senate bill. Conservative commentator Quinn Hillier said in the Washington Examiner, the House bill adds to the work already done by the Senate and fills in almost all gaps with admirable and sensible specificity. There are many other examples from conservative commentators as well. I urge my Republican colleagues to read those articles and editorials in full. Before the process was over, we had to iron out some differences with the Senate's version of the same bill. I thought ours was stronger, but the Senate bill was good. Ultimately, the Senate version of the bill passed both houses of Congress. The new law may have addressed future January 6th turmoil, but I knew that we still faced a significant threat, a possible second Trump term as president. 58. Unfit for any office. As soon as our October 2022 hearing ended, the January 6th committee shifted full-time into working on its final report. During my time in government, I had seen many reports assembled after congressional hearings. Most of them have no impact. They take an immense amount of time to create and are generally read by very few people. We decided at the outset of our hearings that we would need to explain how all of Donald Trump's various efforts to overturn the election fit together. This was a principal goal of my opening statement on June 9th, 2022, and it was why we had organized our hearings around that 7-part plan. Our report would need to clearly detail the complexity of that plan. We also expected that a fair number of Select Committee staffers would depart before we had finished, pursuing other legal opportunities or Hill positions. This would be an intense process in a brief span of time, carried out by our remaining dedicated staff. Evidence had been the prime, almost exclusive focus of our hearings. Our report also had to avoid exaggeration. We wanted its every paragraph and section to be meticulously sourced and supported. We also aimed to produce a carefully drafted criminal referral. After Judge Carter's first ruling in March of 2022, finding that it was likely Donald Trump and John Eastman had violated 2 criminal statutes, I believed there was no doubt that the committee would make such a criminal referral. By early November, we had further concluded that we would need some form of executive summary, something that would stand alone, yet effectively present our key findings and evidence. In the many months since the report's December 2022 publication, I've talked to hundreds of people who've read the executive summary, including college students studying the institutions of our democracy. The executive summary served its purpose, and the chapters and appendices that follow provided substantially greater detail. Chairman Thompson had asked the 4 committee members who were attorneys, Zoe Lofgren, Jamie Raskin, Adam Schiff, and me, to serve on a subcommittee to make recommendations to the full committee concerning criminal referrals. John Wood, with substantial help from Tim Hafey and many others, spent a great deal of time drafting and editing the section on criminal referrals in our report. Others, including Brittany Record, had also been of crucial help on these issues. Our hearings had spotlighted many specific moments when Donald Trump, presented with a clear choice, chose to act unlawfully and in direct contravention of his duty. In my speech about Meadows' contempt a year earlier, I had quoted the words of the criminal statute about obstructing or impeding an official proceeding, 18 U.S.C. Section 1512c2. Judge Carter had relied on that and, in the John Eastman privilege case, on another provision concerning anyone who conspires to commit an offense against the U.S., 18 U.S.C. Section 371. But there were several other potentially applicable provisions of criminal law as well, from the straightforward, transmitting falsely certified electoral votes to the executive branch and Congress, 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, to the more complex, assisting or aiding and comforting the ongoing violence at the Capitol, 18 U.S.C. Section 2383. By this time, we also recognized that both the Department of Justice and Georgia's Fulton County District Attorney might utilize other theories. For example, the department's Justice Manual lays out multiple options for prosecuting defendants who interfere with elections. And from what we were hearing, we thought Fulton County might be pursuing something like the Georgia equivalent of a RICO, or racketeering theory. The committee had also heard all manner of straw man arguments, which seemed to turn on Donald Trump's speechwriter having inserted the word peacefully in one place in the president's January 6th ellipse speech. The ploy didn't sway us, for it was obvious what, or rather who, had motivated the deadly violence. Trump supporters involved in the havoc told us the same thing over and over again. And our criminal referrals were not solely or even largely based upon the words of incitement in Trump's ellipse speech. The committee's referrals were much broader and more comprehensive. We had uncovered far more inappropriate and illegal conduct over the prior year. As we drafted the executive summary and criminal referrals, Tom Jocelyn was working with Kristen Ammerling, Dan George, and the key remaining committee investigators to draft and edit the report's chapters. Tom also structured and wrote the final chapter, a detailed anatomy of the attack. James Sasso, Marcus Childress, and David Weinberg also made important contributions, including in producing this portion of the report. We wanted to be certain that the historical record included a clear description of each phase of the assault. This was crucial to combating disinformation and making sure the American people learned the truth. Given the sensitivity of and media interest in our work, plus the ongoing danger of leaks, we assigned each member of the committee a separate binder that would remain locked in the committee's reading room, an ornate space in a corner of the Capitol's ground floor that Speaker Pelosi had set aside for the committee's use. Members could review updated sections of the report and ask questions or provide comments on a rolling basis. Committee staffer Jacob Nelson was tasked with ensuring that members' edits were incorporated and their questions were answered. This work, overseen by Kristen Ammerling and Dan George, was no small task. We were working to complete our report before the 117th Congress adjourned. In cases where members had conflicting comments or questions about input from other members, Jacob elevated those issues so they could be resolved. Jamie Fleet, Jacob Nelson, and I set up shop 2 floors below the reading room in my hideaway office in the Capitol basement. We spent many long hours around the same table where months earlier we had conducted those vital witness interviews with Sarah Matthews and Cassidy Hutchinson, going page by page through each section of the final report. Jacob shuttled back and forth between the hideaway and the member reading room as we finalized the document. On one of our last evenings in the hideaway, Terry McCullough, Speaker Pelosi's chief of staff, surprised us with a delivery of midnight snacks. She knew we'd been down there around the clock, working to meet our deadline. I looked up from the pages of the report to see that Terry was sporting a Team Cheney hoodie. It made me smile. It was a touching symbol of the unprecedented alliance we had formed, beyond partisan politics, to do what had to be done for our country. As we prepared the final report for publication, we also got ready to release the committee's interview transcripts. We ultimately released all but a handful. Only for certain Secret Service, national security, and military witnesses was the January 6th Select Committee obligated, as a condition for obtaining testimony, to return the transcripts to the government entity involved. In the few cases of this type, the committee requested that the government entities perform whatever redactions were necessary to safeguard sensitive national security information, and then supply the edited transcripts to the National Archives. Committee staffers also released transcripts to the Department of Justice, and earlier still, they had been briefing prosecutors about specific witness testimony and other elements of our evidence. Our transcripts will remain accessible at the website of the U.S. Government Publishing Office, www.govinfo.gov. They will also be preserved for history in the National Archives. Occasionally, people such as Tucker Carlson would make transparently false claims about evidence supposedly in the committee's possession. At one point, Carlson alleged that a mass of secret Capitol Hill videos, apparently released to him on Kevin McCarthy's orders, revealed that our committee had been lying to the public. This was intentional disinformation. In an order entered in the obstruction of an official proceeding prosecution of Jacob QAnon Shaman Chansley, Senior United States District Judge Royce Lamberth explained Tucker's lies this way. Finally, the court would be remiss if it did not address the ill-advised television program of March 6, 2023. Not only was the broadcast replete with misstatements and misrepresentations regarding the events of January 6, 2021, too numerous to count, the host explicitly questioned the integrity of this court, not to mention the legitimacy of the entire U.S. criminal justice system, with inflammatory characterizations of cherry-picked videos stripped of their proper context. In so doing, he called on his followers to, quote, reject the evidence of their eyes and ears, language resembling the destructive, misguided rhetoric that fueled the events of January 6th in the first place. The court finds it alarming that the host's viewers throughout the nation so readily heeded his command. But this court cannot and will not reject the evidence before it, nor should the public. Members of the public who are concerned about the evidence presented in Mr. Chansley's case and others like it may view the public docket and even attend court proceedings in these cases. Those of us who have presided over dozens of cases arising from, listened to hundreds of hours of testimony describing, and reviewed thousands of pages of briefing about the attack on our democracy of January 6th, know all too well that neither the events of that day nor any particular defendant's involvement can be fully captured in a seconds-long video carelessly or perhaps even cynically aired in a television segment or attached to a tweet. On December 19, 2022, the Select Committee held its final public meeting. We had several purposes for this meeting, including announcing our criminal referrals and the imminent release of the final report. But I also wanted to underscore the historical context for what we were doing and how I viewed our labors of the last 18 months. In almost every generation, Americans have given their lives to preserve the ideals of our founders. Each generation in our nation must be a steward of our history. But American history is not just our legacy. The United States is proof that human freedom can survive what has destroyed other democracies over millennia of human history. At no prior point in my life had I believed that we were on the precipice of losing that legacy. Virtually everyone on either side of the aisle had agreed with the fundamental ideals that built our republic. But all that had changed on January 6th of 2021. We seemed in danger of losing what so many in previous generations had sacrificed for. I began my remarks at our December 19th meeting this way.
In April of 1861, when Abraham Lincoln issued the first call for volunteers for the Union Army, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Fletcher Cheney, joined the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He fought through all 4 years of the Civil War, from Chickamauga to Stones River to Atlanta. He marched with his unit in the Grand Review of Troops up Pennsylvania Avenue in May of 1865, past a reviewing stand where President Johnson and General Grant were seated. Silas Canfield, the regimental historian of the 21st Ohio Volunteer Infantry, described the men in the unit this way. He said they had a just appreciation of the value and advantage of free government and the necessity of defending and maintaining it. And they enlisted, prepared to accept all the necessary labors, fatigues, exposures, dangers, and even death for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions. I have found myself thinking often, especially since January 6th, of my great-great-grandfather and all those in every generation who have sacrificed so much for the unity of our nation and the perpetuity of our institutions.
When you serve in Congress, you have the privilege of walking through a shrine to our history every day, through the Capitol Rotunda, through Statuary Hall, past reminders of those who have come before. I did that on January 5th, 2021, again on the evening of January 6th, and repeatedly during the investigation. The statues and paintings have a purpose. They are there to remind elected representatives why they are serving. If we are so inclined, we can descend into pettiness, into the day-to-day muck of partisanship, and surely some of that is unavoidable. On many issues, the people of the United States are not united. But when the fundamental ideals of our nation come to bear, we must be united. When our country faces a crisis, we must find our noble purpose. Some things are beyond partisanship. That is the reason we all take an oath. One thing was now unavoidably apparent to any objective observer. Donald Trump had demonstrated that he is unfit for any office. Of course, our investigation never could have succeeded without the willing participation of many Republicans, including those working in the Trump administration. In my remarks, I noted that
many of our committee's witnesses showed selfless patriotism, and their words and courage will be remembered.
I also recognized that
the brave men and women of the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and all the other law enforcement officers who fought to defend us that day saved lives and our democracy.
nothing in our hearings, in our investigation, or in our final report would have been possible without the dedication of our expert staff, nor without the commitment the full attention and the leadership of Chairman Thompson and the members of the January 6th committee. This had not been an easy road, and it was not a road that was guaranteed to end in success. For various reasons, many members of the January 6th committee would not be returning to Congress in the coming weeks. But we knew that what we had done was right, and we knew that it had been necessary. I ended with this.
Finally, I wish to thank my colleagues on this committee. It has been a tremendous honor to serve with all of you. We have accomplished great and important things together, and I hope we have set an example. And I also want to thank all of those who have honorably contributed to the work of our committee and to our report. We have accomplished much over a short period of time. Many of you sacrificed for the good of our nation. You have helped make history, and I hope helped to right the ship.
Epilogue. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to